Paul and Emily had planned the hike for weeks. The forest near their hometown was known for its dense foliage and winding trails, providing the perfect escape from their daily routines. With backpacks loaded and spirits high, they set out early one Saturday morning. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Birds chirped overhead, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. Paul and Emily walked side by side, chatting about their plans for the future, occasionally stopping to admire a particularly interesting tree or to take a photo. They had been walking for a couple of hours when they decided to take a break. Finding a small clearing, they sat down on a fallen log and pulled out their water bottles. As they rested, the forest seemed to grow quieter around them. The rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds faded into an eerie silence. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul listened intently. At first, he heard nothing unusual, but then a faint rustling sound reached his ears. It was coming from somewhere behind them, deeper in the woods. "Probably just an animal," Paul said, trying to sound casual. "Deer, matey." Emily nodded, but her eyes darted nervously around the clearing. They finished their water and decided to continue their hike. As they walked, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest, once inviting and serene, now seemed oppressive and menacing. They pressed on, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set Paul's nerves on edge. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. "Paul, look," Emily said, stopping suddenly. He turned to see her pointing at the ground. There, in the soft earth of the trail, were footprints. They were fresh and clearly defined, too large to be theirs and heading in the same direction. "Someone else is out here," Paul said, his voice tense. "We should turn back." Emily agreed, and they quickly retraced their steps. But as they hurried back along the trail, the sense of being followed intensified. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees forming a claustrophobic tunnel. They reached the clearing where they had rested earlier and paused to catch their breath. Paul scanned the surrounding trees, searching for any sign of movement. The forest was still and silent, but the oppressive feeling remained. "Let's get out of here," Emily said, her voice trembling. They continued their hurried pace, the trail twisting and turning through the dense forest. Paul kept his eyes on the path ahead, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was right behind them. Suddenly, Emily stumbled and fell to the ground. Paul rushed to help her up, and as he did, he heard it, a low guttural sound, like a growl, coming from the shadows. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Run," Paul shouted, pulling Emily to her feet. They sprinted down the trail, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The growling sound grew louder, closer, but Paul didn't dare look back. They ran until their legs ached and their lungs burned, finally bursting out of the forest and into the safety of their car. Paul fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and they quickly drove away. As they sped down the road, Paul glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing them. But there was nothing, just the dark, ominous outline of the forest. They didn't speak on the drive home, each lost in their own thoughts. The forest, once a place of beauty and tranquility, had become a place of fear and danger. Paul couldn't shake the feeling that they had escaped something truly sinister, and he knew that he would never look at the woods the same way again. Days passed, but the events in the forest lingered in Paul's mind like a persistent shadow. He and Emily avoided talking about it, but the silence only deepened their unease. They returned to their routines, yet the feeling of being watched never completely left them. One evening, as they were preparing dinner, the phone rang. Paul answered, expecting it to be a friend or family member, but instead, a deep, raspy voice spoke. "Did you enjoy your hike?" Paul's blood ran cold. He glanced at Emily, who looked back at him with wide, questioning eyes. "Who is this?" Paul demanded, his voice trembling. The line went dead. For a moment, Paul stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. When he finally put it down, he tried to brush it off as a prank, but the unease gnawed at him. That night, sleep eluded them both. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified, feeding their growing paranoia. Paul kept a baseball bat by the bed, his eyes darting to the window at the slightest sound. The next morning, Paul found something disturbing on their front porch. A piece of paper with a crude drawing of two figures running through a forest, a dark shape lurking behind them. Paul felt a chill run down his spine as he showed it to Emily. She gasped, her face pale with fear. "We need to call the police," she said. The police took their statement and the drawing, but with no concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to patrol the area more frequently, but Paul and Emily were left feeling vulnerable and exposed. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. They received anonymous phone calls at odd hours, always silent, but for the sound of breathing on the other end. They found footprints around their house, large and fresh, just like the ones in the forest. Paul knew they couldn't live like this. He decided to take matters into his own hands. That evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Paul sat in the living room with the baseball bat, waiting. He was determined to catch whoever was tormenting them. Hours passed, and just as Paul was beginning to doze off, he heard a noise outside. He stood up, gripping the bat tightly, and moved quietly to the window. Through the curtains, he saw a shadowy figure standing by the edge of their property, watching the house. Heart pounding, Paul threw open the door and ran outside, shouting. The figure turned and fled into the darkness. Paul chased after them, but the intruder was fast, disappearing into the trees at the edge of the yard. Paul stopped, panting heavily, and stared into the dark forest. He realized with a sinking feeling that he couldn't chase them on their own turf. The forest was vast and filled with countless hiding places. Defeated, Paul returned to the house. Emily met him at the door, her eyes filled with worry. "It's not safe here," she said. "We need to leave." Reluctantly, Paul agreed. They packed a few essentials and drove to a nearby motel, hoping the distance would provide some relief. For the first time in days, they slept peacefully. The next morning, Paul checked his phone and found a new message. It was a photo of their empty house, taken from the driveway. Underneath it was a simple message: "You can't run forever." Paul's hands trembled as he showed the message to Emily. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to end this," she said. "We can't live our lives in fear." Paul nodded, his resolve hardening. They returned to their house, prepared to face whatever or whoever was stalking them. They set up cameras around the property and stayed vigilant, waiting for the stalker to make their next move. Days turned into weeks, and the harassment gradually stopped. The phone calls ceased, and no more drawings or footprints appeared. Paul and Emily remained cautious, but life slowly returned to normal. Though the stalker was never caught, Paul and Emily learned to live with the uncertainty. They never returned to the forest, but they refused to let fear control their lives. The experience had changed them, but it had also brought them closer together, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. As time passed, the memories of that terrifying hike faded, but they never forgot the lesson they learned. Sometimes, the real monsters aren't in the woods, but in the shadows, watching and waiting. Sean gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white in the dim light of the dashboard. The rhythmic thump of the tires against the cracked, desolate road was the only sound accompanying him through the darkness. It was well past midnight, and the route through the old forest was notorious for its eerie atmosphere. The night had fallen swiftly, and Sean regretted not leaving his friend's house earlier. He promised himself he would, but the convivial conversation and a few beers had pushed the hour later than planned. Now he was driving through the pitch-black forest, the road ahead illuminated only by the weak beams of his headlights. As he drove, a sense of unease began to creep over him. The trees seemed to close in on the road, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch him. The shadows cast by the headlights danced and flickered, playing tricks on his mind. He told himself it was just the isolation getting to him. After about 20 minutes of driving, his car's engine suddenly sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered, and the car began to slow. Sean's heart raced as he pulled over to the side of the road, the vehicle coasting to a stop. He turned the key in the ignition, but the engine only groaned in protest before falling silent. "Great," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. He glanced at his phone, but of course there was no signal. He was miles away from the nearest town, stranded in the middle of nowhere. Sean decided to step out and check the engine. He popped the hood and peered inside, though he wasn't exactly sure what he was looking for. The cold night air bit at his skin, and he shivered as he fumbled with the unfamiliar parts. After a few futile minutes, he slammed the hood shut in frustration. He was about to climb back into the car when he heard it, a soft rustling from the trees. He froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, and Sean's heart began to pound. He grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment and shone it into the darkness, but saw nothing. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the night. He turned back to the car, deciding it was better to wait until morning, when he could flag down another vehicle. As he sat inside, the rustling came again. this time accompanied by the distinct crunch of footsteps on the gravel. Scene's breath caught in his throat. Someone was out there. He locked the doors, gripping the flashlight tightly. The footsteps grew closer, circling the car. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, each thud a reminder of his vulnerability. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Scene dared to peek out of the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. He saw nothing, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Just as he began to relax, a loud bang jolted him from his seat. Something had hit the car. Scene jumped, dropping the flashlight, and fumbled to pick it up. He shone it outside, the beam trembling with his unsteady hands. His pulse raced as he scanned the surroundings, but still, there was nothing. His mind raced with possibilities. Was it a prank? Some kind of wild animal? Or something far worse? He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The seconds dragged on like hours, each one filled with the anticipation of the unknown. Then, as if in response to his unspoken fears, a low guttural whisper floated through the air. It was indistinct but undeniably human. Scene's blood ran cold. He pressed himself against the seat, wishing he could melt into the fabric and disappear. The whispering continued, an eerie murmur that seemed to come from all directions at once. Scene's hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to make sense of the words. They were faint, but he could just make out a single chilling phrase, "We see you." Scene's heart hammered in his chest as he looked around frantically. The flashlight beam flickered, casting erratic shadows that only heightened his terror. He knew he couldn't stay in the car. He had to do something. Summoning every ounce of courage, he took a deep breath and decided to confront whatever was out there. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door and stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting him like a wall. He held the flashlight in front of him, its beam a fragile barrier against the darkness. "Who's there?" he shouted, trying to keep his voice steady. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an unnerving silence. Scene's breath formed white puffs in the frigid air as he strained to see anything beyond the reach of his flashlight. Then, just as he was about to retreat to the car, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. His heart leaped into his throat as he focused the beam on the spot. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure, but it disappeared before he could be sure. The whispering resumed, louder this time, and Scene realized with dawning horror that it was coming from multiple sources. He was surrounded. Panicked, he turned to run back to the car, but his foot caught on something, and he stumbled, falling to the ground. As he scrambled to his feet, the whispers grew into a cacophony, a chorus of disembodied voices closing in on him. Scene's mind raced, and he bolted for the car, but the whispers seemed to follow, growing ever closer. He flung open the door and threw himself inside, locking it behind him. Breathing heavily, Scene sat in the darkened car, his mind reeling. He didn't know what was out there, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to get out of this forest before it was too late. Scene's hands trembled as he fumbled for the keys, desperately trying to start the car again. The engine sputtered but refused to turn over. The whispers outside grew louder, the voices a terrifying reminder of his precarious situation. He took a deep breath and looked around the car, searching for anything that could help him. His eyes landed on his phone, still useless without a signal. He grabbed it anyway, clutching it like a lifeline. He had to think clearly. Panic would only make things worse. A sudden loud bang on the roof of the car made Scene jump. He aimed the flashlight at the ceiling, the beam illuminating the interior in a stark white light. The roof dented under the weight of whatever was on top. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized he couldn't stay inside the car. With a surge of adrenaline, Scene unlocked the doors and bolted from the car, running into the forest. The whispers followed, an eerie chorus of indistinguishable voices. He didn't dare look back, focusing instead on navigating the dark, twisted path ahead. The forest was a labyrinth of trees and undergrowth, each step a battle against the tangled roots and branches. Scene's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed forward, driven by sheer terror. The whispers seemed to be all around him, closing in with every step. Suddenly, he stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old, decrepit cabin, its windows dark and lifeless. Scene hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. The whispers were growing louder, and he knew he couldn't stay out in the open. He sprinted towards the cabin, hoping it would offer some refuge. He pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind him. The interior was musty and cold, filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. Scene's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the room. He found a wooden bar and slid across the door, securing it as best as he could. The whispers were still audible, but they seemed more distant now, muffled by the cabin walls. Scene took a moment to catch his breath, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan. He explored the cabin, his flashlight revealing sparse furnishings, a broken chair, a rickety table, and an old dusty bed. In one corner, he found a small fireplace with a stack of wood beside it. He quickly set to work, lighting a fire to ward off the cold and provide some semblance of safety. As the flames crackled and cast a warm glow, Scene felt a momentary sense of relief. He sat by the fire, trying to gather his thoughts. The whispers outside had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that was almost worse. He knew he couldn't stay here forever, but he needed to rest and think. His mind drifted to the events of the night, trying to make sense of the inexplicable. He wondered if he was hallucinating, the result of stress and exhaustion. But the fear felt too real, the danger too immediate to be a mere figment of his imagination. Just as he began to relax, a loud crash shattered the silence. The door to the cabin burst open, the wooden bar splintering under the force. Scene leaped to his feet, his heart racing. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. He backed away, his eyes darting around the room for a weapon. He grabbed a broken chair leg, brandishing it like a club. Shadows moved in the doorway, and Scene braced himself for the worst. A figure stepped into the cabin, its features obscured by the darkness. Scene's grip tightened on the makeshift weapon, ready to defend himself. The figure moved closer, and Scene could finally make out its face, a man disheveled and wild-eyed with a crazed look in his eyes. "Who are you?" Scene demanded, his voice shaking. The man said nothing, only smiled, a twisted, sinister grin that sent a chill down Scene's spine. Without warning, the man lunged at Scene, and they both fell to the ground, struggling. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the cabin like a sinister chant. Scene fought with all his strength, using the chair leg to fend off his attacker. In the chaos, the fire flickered and began to die, casting the room into darkness. Scene managed to break free, scrambling to his feet. He ran for the door, but the man grabbed his leg, pulling him back. Desperation gave Scene a surge of strength, and he kicked the man hard, sending him sprawling. Scene stumbled out of the cabin, the whispers following him like a relentless tide. He didn't stop to look back, his only thought to escape the nightmare. He ran through the forest, the trees a blur around him, until he finally saw the glimmer of headlights in the distance. With a final burst of energy, Scene reached the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver, an elderly man, looked at him with concern as Scene breathlessly explained his ordeal. They drove away from the forest, the whispers fading into the distance.